Talking about the tribal development programs, now appears the most crucial question: who owns the program? Directly, tribal people should be owning the program. Could one say that? In fact, tribals do not know why the so called development programs were drawn up in their name. Forget about their participating in deciding the contents of the program. Obviously, one cannot say the tribals own the program. They are now being rehabilitated. First of all, they did not know why they were evicted from their original habitat at all. They had no decision in this. Perhaps it came imposed on them. They did not even understand why they were being shifted. They did not know where they will be shifted and what is being done in the development of their own group. Hard to believe, hard to accept, hard to understand. If you think of yourself as a tribal adult, you just do not know what is happening around, and the entire group is now evicted from the forest area or the mining area into a so called rehabilitation camp. And now dig deep into the term rehabilitation. You find it difficult to believe that this is rehabilitation, because the word rehabilitation is from the root habitat. Can you imagine that a tribal group which is evicted from a certain original area of their residence, they can be recreated into a real habitat in the so called rehabilitation camp? Rehabilitation camp is just a place where they wanted to accommodate the tribals who are evicted from their original area of habitat. Now, what happens in this rehabilitated area? It is an entirely new world for the tribal people. Forget about the people, non-tribals who are new, non-tribals in the form of contractors, non-tribals in the form of people manning the government machinery, in fact, even the non-government organizations machinery, everybody is new, the whole world is new, what is being transacted is new. Now, ultimately come to think of the so called tribal school. Do the tribal people own the tribal school? They do not know what for it is started. They are being asked to go to the school. They do not know why they have to learn, why they have to become literate. They do not understand, and adult people among the tribals will have to be made literate just because the governmental machinery needs some records for what is being done. Now, come to think of these tribal schools, which tribals do not understand, have been started for their sake in the name of their development, and therefore, many of them find it impossible to use this system. In fact, the corruption that takes over in the whole situation now makes it difficult for an average tribal parent to put the son or daughter in the school unless something is spent. And now think of what is being spent. For the tribal people who had no monetary economy in their existence in their own tribal style, now come into touch with the non-tribal people. For everything they have to shell out something on the palm. There is so much of wastage of tribal schools. In fact, many tribal schools which have been started, for namesake there is on the list certain names of tribal people, much of it being cornered by the non-tribal people in the rural neighborhood. Now, in this episode, we have tried to understand special problems of tribal people, particularly the most widely debated problems, that is poverty and illiteracy. Now, think of poverty, we said, so long as poverty is accepted as a monetary concept, it becomes difficult, we understood, to apply it in the case of tribals, because they have lived for generations in a non-monetary economy. They did not even realize that they were so called living in poverty unless the non-tribals pointed out certain aspects of economic terms as per which they could be declared as poor. Otherwise, tribal people lived accepting whatever was there in their environment as what is naturally given them. And come to think of literacy and education, we wanted to make them literate, whereas these people all through generations had lived without using any kind of a script for their communication system. If they are to be made literate, it is not for the sake of tribals themselves, it is for the sake of the non-tribals who are dealing with them in so called modern terms, in the so called development and progress framework, which itself is something new for an average tribal. So, there is so much that has been happening in the name of tribal development. Forget about tribals participating meaningfully in this, they do not even understand what is happening in their world. In the previous episode, we started off with some of the noted problems with respect to the tribals, which are widely discussed and debated. We learned about poverty and its implications for tribal life. We now take up indebtedness. All in one word, indebtedness is a new word for the tribal people, because indebtedness is basically in terms of monetary economy. And we already know that an average tribal people lived in a non-monetary economy. So, indebtedness or anything to do with the monetary transactions is an entirely new word for the tribal people. And indebtedness came in two forms. When these tribal people got evicted from their original habitat and were rehabilitated, they were brought to an entirely new world in direct interaction with the non-tribal people. The other way indebtedness came into the lives of the tribal people was when non-tribal people were given the liberty to enter into the tribal areas for dealing with the resources in the tribal areas in the form of contractors. They brought the tribal people into various kinds of transactions, and before they could realize, the tribal people became indebted to the non-tribal people. Much of it was in the form of their land ownership. We already know that individual land ownership was something alien to the tribal people in their style of life, and thanks to the development programs which also brought in the concept of individual property, the first thing that happened in the realm of indebtedness to the tribal people was in the form of losing their land, whether they were owning it at the family level or the community level. Land alienation has been one of the most crucial agrarian issues haunting the tribal world. Tribal people who, as we said earlier, were not very comfortable with the idea of owning lands at the individual level. In fact, land ownership was at the community level, clan level, and the lowest was family level. Individual ownership was totally unknown to them, and only the development programs brought for the first time into picture in the tribal world the concept of owning the lands at the individual level, and they got alienated before they realized that they were getting alienated. For one thing, individual ownership of property brought into focus the use of the written word as a record of ownership, which was totally unknown to the tribal people. So, they got alienated from their lands before they could realize that they were getting alienated. They got indebted to the non-tribal people in some fashion or the other to a smaller or greater extent before they could realize that they were getting indebted. Now, what are the measures needed in order to control this problem of indebtedness among the tribal people? One is prevention. Earlier it was tried that non-tribal people could not go into the tribal areas at all. Probably that was the good beginning, but later on development programs could not stop non-tribal people going into the tribal areas, particularly after many of the tribals had to be evicted from their original habitat. So, it became difficult to prevent, but prevention is one of the measures needed. Only when non-tribal people and tribal people come into regular interaction with each other, anything like indebtedness or exploitation can take place, but wherever possible, government should take measures in order to prevent. Another is protect. Have certain kinds of laws which protect the tribal people from getting exploited monetarily, dragging them on to indebtedness, especially whenever they come across the non-tribal people in their regular transaction. Lot of measures were taken in the form of microcredit facilities for the tribal people, so that they could go into entrepreneurship, they could have their own efforts in order to improve themselves. But then we already learnt that the concept of development, Progress was not in the vocabulary of the tribal people at all. Therefore, whatever was done in the name of providing credit facilities, additional measures taken in order to help these tribal people could not bear too much of fruit, because of the non-understanding among the tribal people of whatever was happening in the name of transactions with the non-tribal people. And non-tribal people came not only in the form of contractors, they came as part of the machinery of governmental agencies as well as non-governmental agencies. Now, one way of trying to sort out this problem is the spread of banking facilities for the tribal people. It is a very quixotic situation for the tribal people. It is good to hear that you spread the banking facilities and provide the banking facilities to the tribal people even exclusively. But then what happens? Again, bank depends on literacy, and to the extent to which the system depends on literacy, tribal people very soon become victims of the machinations of the people who have learnt better, who can use the written word better, more efficiently in a very manipulative manner. Therefore, even banking facilities and expanding them in tribal areas was not of much help for the tribal people. Now, take up the issue of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship again, for people who simply did not have the term development and progress in their vocabulary, was a totally new word. The very idea of thinking of something new. Now, thinking of something new presupposes that you are creative, you are imaginative, and for tribal people who just lived from day to day, the idea of tomorrow, idea of future, imaginative thinking was limited to their crafts, but not to their enterprise in order to develop themselves economically. Therefore, again those who were put under the entrepreneurship training programs fell into the hands of the, because of their gullibility, in the hands of the non-tribal people who were always adept at taking the tribal people for a ride for better benefits for themselves. Now, legislation. There were a lot of legislations in order to deal with the problems of the tribal people, but we know too well, not only tribals, even in general in India, we know too well that legislation by itself cannot bring about any kind of change. Legislation of whatever kind is to be accompanied by a social kind of a movement among the people who are dealing with the tribals. Same thing happened. We provided legal aid. Even legal aid had to be given to the people. Legal aid provision had to be told to the tribal people. By themselves, tribal people would not approach any legal aid agency for getting redressal from their problems. Then it brings us to creating an awareness and educating the tribals. Another important aspect that has been haunting the tribal world in more recent times is bonded labor, and tribal people very easily get into the bondage. After all, they know only hard work and almost nothing else. Very naive people, very simplistic people. They are just carrying out their day-to-day activities without even realizing whether they are getting any benefit out and out of what they do. Now, look into the creditor-debtor relationship that gets built up between the tribals and non-tribal people. Earlier we said land ownership or whatever is owned has been only at the community level, clan level or family level. Now, that what happens? An individual goes into some kind of debt. For how long? Indebtedness takes over. The non-tribal person takes over the individual for manipulation. Does it end with the individual? Absolutely not. It may spread over to the family. Because the husband got into the indebtedness with a non-tribal person, non-tribal manipulator now takes over the family. The wife starts working in order to clear the indebtedness. The children start working. How long? Don't know. It is left totally open. The duration for which they will remain indebted could be infinite. Terms are not specified at all. After all, tribal people are traditionally used to conventional way of dealing with things. terms are not always purely economic. Therefore, the family of the tribal people may come under a whole variety of exploitation, not always economic, in order to save themselves from the problem of indebtedness. Now, the concept of the adverse, often illegal ones, do not know when a non-tribal person deals with a tribal person and exploits the tribal person, it often becomes difficult for the tribal person to draw the line between what is legal, what is illegal, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, because tribal people by their very nature are quite used to conventional way of doing things. So, therefore, they are so used to the customary way of doing things, they will easily accept that the entire family goes into bondage because of the indebtedness of one person in the family. Normally, it is the man, it could also be the woman. So, the entire family goes into bondage because of this indebtedness. Now, what are the causes of this bonded labor? In the agricultural sector, the main cause has been land alienation. Some of these tribal people are given to various kinds of pastimes like gambling. In fact, one of the reasons often quoted for land alienation is that the man in the family goes in for gambling, pledging the pieces of land, and ultimately gets alienated from the land. But then all interactions with the tribal people is always lurking in the corner the danger of getting into indebtedness. One crucial aspect with respect to alienation is the common property resources. In fact, the tribal people have been using all that is available within their own habitat very freely. In fact, the idea of common property resources is something new. Without their knowledge they were using, but the concept itself is new. But what happens in the name of development and change in the tribal areas is, it is the very common property resources that will be exploited in the name of development and progress. Therefore, what happens in the wake of a development program in the tribal area, an average tribal now finds it difficult to have access to common property resources, which he had always used without any kind of a hindrance or a hazard. So, denial of access to common property resources becomes a very serious problem in the name of tribal development, so far as an average tribal member in a tribe is concerned. Now, look at the socio-economic dominance of groups. What happens in the tribal life? There has been no dominance as such. People worked and worked. Whatever was the product, there was no control over that as such in terms of the monetary parameter of measuring what they were doing. In fact, there was no hierarchy, there was no leadership except for the tribal chief. They would work and hand over a certain part as a tribute to the tribal leader. Now, dominant groups come into picture in the wake of tribal development. Now, after all, we know in any society during the changing times, the smarter ones take over the change situation. Smarter ones take over the possibilities of progress and development in the changed situation. This is what exactly happened, and obviously smarter ones were not always among the tribal people. In any development program demanding change in the existing situation, it was a non-tribal almost as a rule who took over the changing factors which were contributing to betterment of conditions, and they took control of such factors. Now, changing labor requirements. Now, the problem for the tribal people when they go to rehabilitation area, not always labor market is providing them opportunities to make a living. It depends on the seasons, therefore, it depends on where they are rehabilitated. So, changing labor requirements have also been responsible for changing the lifestyle of the tribal people without their own knowledge. Actually, they became victims of this rather than the leaders in this kind of a changed situation. But then the weakness of the tribal people to spend on social rituals and of course, on treatment for illness. All this made in the absence of provisions for meeting this expenditure, this made them go differently into deeper and deeper bondage under the non-tribal people. One of the most ready examples is brick kilns. The tribal people who work in the brick kilns, invariably one will find that the brick kilns, the owner is not always around, it is the middleman who manage the whole situation. After all, the middleman wants to make better use of available finance in the whole enterprise, and ultimately it results in manipulating the payments to the poor tribal people who work in the brick kilns, either through part payment or weekly payment, or making a bulk payment once in a way, or making mostly monthly payments. But the worst payment arrangement for the tribal people involved in these brick kilns has been that for their own urgent needs, they take advance money, and you find them working for weeks and weeks without getting any money, being told by these people who are the middleman in the whole arrangement that they are only repaying the advance that they have got. After all, being new to monetary economy, they are not able to get an exact measure of how much they have worked for, what is being accounted for in terms of money and payment. Now, all of this are leading them deeper into bondage. It is a very direct equation. Poorer are the people, deeper they go into bondage, and deeper they go into bondage, poorer they become. Another important dimension in which the tribal people have gone into lot of indebtedness are stone quarries. Now, just imagine the brick kilns in the land area, on the plain area, stone quarries on the mountains and hills, where there are precious rocks that are available for quarrying, and miners and crushers, tribal people come to work. After all, you need local people, localized labor for the hard work, and an average tribal is known for hard work. An average tribal adult man or woman does not shirk away hard work. This is almost the only thing that they have known, because of living in such areas all their life over the generations. So, therefore, what happens? The local labor is used, and they are again not paid very regularly. This has expanded to other areas, like the examples from Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh. People who work in power looms and hand looms, they also undergo lot of exploitation. They work and work. In fact, they work long hours, not limited to the factory rules of 8 hour duration and all that. They could work much longer and not getting paid very regularly. This is again another kind of exploitation that these people are going into. Every little thing that they get into in the hands of the non-tribal ultimately sooner or later leads to some kind of indebtedness or the other. But the most interesting thing that happens in this field is the capital and the material may not sometimes be invested by the people who are localized. The owner who invests money could be elsewhere, not only in the near town, it could be even in a different state of India, and the people who are operating, naturally they want to make the best of it in the absence of the person who has invested money and material in running the enterprise, and everything ultimately boils down to exploiting the tribal people more and more. Now, look at the land alienation issue. Why does this happen at all? Why do people go into land alienation? What are the causes behind all this? Ownership types. As I said much earlier, tribal people had only known community based ownership and lower level clan based ownership, and the lowest level family based ownership. Individual ownership of anything that is in their habitat was almost totally unknown to the tribal people. Therefore, when in the name of development programs, individual ownership of land comes into being and non-tribal people come onto the picture, the entire balance of their ownership of their habitat is totally disturbed, and the tribal people are completely confused in the whole situation. And look at the forms of alienation, manipulation of land records. Everything now depends on literacy, and tribal people are not quite known to it. In fact, they are not quite comfortable with it, because writing has not been part of their life for generations. So, therefore, land records are manipulated, leasing and mortgaging manipulated, and poor tribal people do not know where they put in their thumb impression, they do not know what for they are doing it. So, they raise loans for different reasons and then get into indebtedness. Slackness in implementation of programs has also been responsible. Policy intervention is needed, but then you do not know how the intervention takes place, who comes into picture, who is manipulating what. In fact, when a tribal person comes across a non-tribal person, whether as a contractor or as a government servant involved in implementation of programs, poor tribal person does not know who is honest, who is manipulating, because a lot of things happen which are beyond the comprehension of the average tribal person. Forest policy has been very, very crucial in terms of posing problems for the tribal people. We have known till now that forest dwellers, tribal people, have depended on whatever was available in the forest. They have happily lived with whatever was available. No one to question what they use, what they do not use. But the forest policy under which the forest becomes the government property, these people suddenly become aliens in the forest, where they have lived without knowing that there is a world beyond. Suddenly forest policy makes that this is government property, therefore, they have to be moved out. Now, forest dependency for tribal people who have always lived in the forest has been so complete. When they are taken out of the forest, they simply do not know whatever has been happening in their lives in the name of development and change. Colonial policy has been very, very destructive so far as the people are concerned, but then they still had the right to live in the forest and use the forest products. But post colonial, after India became independent, there has been development induced displacement. Just now we said that forest becomes government property, so forest tribes are evicted from the forest, and they simply do not know what to do beyond that, because they have known no other world. Now, development induced displacement, a very interesting thing that is happening, affecting the tribal people very, very negatively. Development induced, what a misnomer. It is done in the name of larger development, but why tribal people have to be evicted from this particular area? Tribal people do not know. Now, agrarian issues, what happens? Shifting cultivation. They are not allowed to move from place to place as easily as they have been doing. Now, think of the forest where tribal people have been living. Deforestation. An average tribal has never known doing anything negative to the forest that he has been living there. Now, if deforestation takes place by the tribals, it is only because non-tribals are putting them into deforestation. Tribals left to themselves would not get into deforestation at all. Now, we have analyzed so far the ways and means in which the tribal people have gone into indebtedness, have gone into different forms of exploitation by the people who do not belong to them at all. The non-tribals, whether they come in the garb of contractors dealing with the programs or in the garb of different levels of government officials, whoever dealt with the tribal people in the name of development and progress always tried to keep the balance in his or her favor from outside the tribal area, rather than with a genuine interest of helping the tribal people sort out their problems and lead a better life.